At 9:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the massive battleship Yamato, positioned hundreds of miles behind his forward striking force, staring out across the Pacific and waiting for news that he both desperately hoped for and deeply feared, because 6 months earlier his carrier fleet had devastated Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack that shocked the world. And 6 months of seemingly unstoppable Japanese victories had followed exactly as he had predicted. Victories that now culminated in a massive operation against the tiny Midway atoll, where Yamamoto believed Japan could deliver a decisive knockout blow that would finally force the United States to negotiate peace. For converging on Midway were 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same ships that had launched the aircraft over Pearl Harbor, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and the most experienced naval aviators on Earth, men hardened by years of combat in China and the Pacific, and by every conventional military calculation Yamamoto held overwhelming advantage. Yet unlike nearly every other senior Japanese leader, Yamamoto also carried a burden of knowledge that made this moment terrifying rather than triumphant, because he had lived in the United States, walked its streets, studied at its universities, traveled its highways, played poker with its officers, and understood the American character in a way none of his peers could, and that knowledge told him that America was not weak, not soft, not decadent, but rather an industrial colossus with immense productive power and a dangerous capacity for unity and ferocity once provoked. And within 6 hours of that quiet morning aboard Yamato, everything Yamamoto had feared for more than a decade would come true in the catastrophic defeat at Midway. A defeat that marked not only a turning point in the Pacific War, but one of the greatest failures of strategic perception in military history, because Japanese leaders had convinced themselves they understood America when in reality they had constructed a fantasy version of their enemy, a false image rooted in cultural arrogance and wishful thinking that bore almost no resemblance to the nation they had challenged, and that false image shaped decisions that guaranteed Japan's destruction long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. For the fundamental problem Japan faced in 1941 was not military strength but perception, as its leaders genuinely believed Americans were spiritually weak, a belief that was not merely propaganda but deeply internalized by generals and admirals who assumed a society built on individual rights, democracy, and material comfort could never match the fighting spirit of warriors raised in the Bushido tradition. And Japanese officers openly mocked American soldiers as products of a soft culture, pampered by automobiles and consumer comforts, incapable of enduring real hardship, while at the same time glorifying their own people's willingness to sacrifice everything for the nation, dismissing Western concern for individual life as a fatal weakness, because in their thinking a soldier who valued his own survival could never fight with the total commitment required for victory, and this contempt shaped Japanese strategic planning, leading them to believe that Americans confronted with a sudden, shocking defeat would lose their will to fight and sue for peace. Rather than endure a long, bloody conflict, a belief reinforced by intelligence reports highlighting labor strikes, political divisions, isolationist sentiment, and what appeared to be a small, underprepared U.S. military, while American films showing crime and chaos in cities like Chicago and New York further reinforced the image of a violent, undisciplined, morally shallow society, an image that suited Japanese ideological needs but ignored hard evidence. And yet one man understood how catastrophically wrong these assumptions were, a man whose life story uniquely positioned him to see the truth, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, born in 1884 in Niigata Prefecture to a former samurai family fallen on hard times after the Meiji Restoration, a background that instilled discipline, ambition, and a powerful drive to restore family honor through service. Traits that carried him through the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and into the Russo-Japanese War, where he fought at Tsushima aboard the cruiser Nishin, suffering grievous wounds that cost him 2 fingers and left permanent scars, injuries he wore with pride as proof of sacrifice. And as Yamamoto rose through the ranks, his intellect, strategic insight, and fluency in English set him apart. leading to advanced study at the Naval Staff College and eventually to a remarkable assignment in 1919 when he was sent to the United States to study at Harvard University, where he focused academically on the American oil industry while unofficially conducting one of the most thorough first-hand intelligence assessments any Japanese officer ever undertook, traveling across the country, hitchhiking through New England, visiting Midwestern factories, oil fields in Texas, and steel mills in Pennsylvania, living among Americans, talking to workers, and witnessing industrial capacity on a scale that stunned him. Seeing assembly lines produce automobiles at speeds unimaginable in Japan, steel mills pouring out more metal in days than Japan produced in months, and refineries processing more oil than Japan consumed in a year, numbers that made one reality unmistakably clear to Yamamoto's strategic mind. In any prolonged war, industrial capacity was destiny, and America's capacity dwarfed Japan's so completely that victory would be impossible if the conflict dragged on. Yet Yamamoto also discovered something equally important about the American people themselves, finding not softness but practicality, competitiveness, innovation and resilience, a society that argued loudly and criticized its leaders freely yet worked relentlessly and rallied fiercely when challenged, and through countless nights playing poker, a game he became obsessed with. Yamamoto learned to read American psychology, their willingness to bluff, to raise the stakes, and to refuse to fold even when circumstances looked grim. Lessons that shaped both his respect for the enemy and his belief that only a bold, risky opening strike might give Japan a fleeting chance. Because when Yamamoto returned to Japan, he carried a warning that haunted him for the rest of his life. America could not be defeated in a long war, a conviction reinforced during his second posting to the United States in the mid-1920s. Where he observed how quickly American industry had mobilized during World War I and understood that the same factories producing consumer goods could pivot rapidly to weapons production. And throughout the 1930s, Yamamoto repeatedly opposed Japan's aggressive expansion, warning against war with the United States, opposing the invasion of Manchuria, the war in China, and the alliance with Nazi Germany, positions that earned him powerful enemies among militarists who saw him as dangerously unorthodox, even traitorous, and as Japan drifted toward war, Yamamoto issued increasingly blunt predictions, famously stating that he could guarantee victory for 6 months but had no confidence beyond that, because after 6 months American industry would overwhelm Japan with ships, aircraft, trained pilots, and logistics on a scale impossible to counter, warnings that were ignored by leaders convinced of spiritual superiority and blinded by their own propaganda. And when war became inevitable, Yamamoto did his duty, designing the Pearl Harbor attack not out of confidence but desperation, hoping that a stunning blow might buy time or force negotiations. And though the attack succeeded tactically, it failed strategically, leaving American carriers intact, oil facilities untouched, and most importantly unifying the United States in a way Yamamoto knew was fatal. And for exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan surged across the Pacific just as Yamamoto predicted, capturing territory at breathtaking speed, yet the clock was ticking. And when Yamamoto attempted to destroy America's carrier force at Midway, he unknowingly walked into a trap laid by American codebreakers, culminating in a single devastating day that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and most of their elite aviators, losses Japan could never replace, marking the moment when Yamamoto's warnings became irreversible reality. And from that point onward, American industrial might transformed the Pacific War into a grinding struggle of attrition that Japan was doomed to lose, as seen on Guadalcanal, where American logistics, firepower, and endurance shattered Japanese assumptions about American weakness, and year by year the imbalance grew more severe, with American shipyards launching carriers faster than Japan could sink them, American factories producing aircraft by the tens of thousands, and American training programs creating pilots in numbers Japan could not match, until by 1944 the qualitative advantage Japan once held had vanished entirely, and Yamamoto, worn down by the knowledge that his country was fighting a hopeless war, was killed in April 1943 when American fighters intercepted his aircraft in Operation Vengeance, a perfectly timed ambush made possible by the very intelligent superiority Japan had underestimated. and his death symbolized the collapse of Japan's illusions about America. As the war continued relentlessly toward unconditional surrender, firebombed cities, atomic devastation, and total defeat, outcomes that validated every warning Yamamoto had given and exposed the catastrophic cost of underestimating an enemy based on cultural stereotypes rather than reality. For the tragedy of Isoroku Yamamoto was not that he lacked foresight, but that he possessed it and was powerless to alter the course set by leaders who believed what they wanted to believe, dismissing inconvenient truths until it was far too late.